about gaming and informal learning of English in Sweden. So this is my outline for the talk. So I'm going to first introduce an important concept, extramural English, and then I'm going to talk about gaming and proficiency, and then something about the pyramid. And you see the cover here of my dissertation from 2009, which is the first study on this topic. And extramural English, or EE, it refers to this English that people learn outside of school, outside the walls of the classroom. And it's always learner initiated. It has nothing to do with school. It's typically gaming, watching television, listening to music, and those sorts of activities. They can be online, they can also be offline. Typically, this is incidental learning, but also it can be intentional learning. And we've written a book about it, me and my colleague Sylvia. And we know from several studies now that we know there is a positive influence then of extramural English on, for example, vocabulary, on speaking, on writing, on willingness to communicate, on reading comprehension, on listening comprehension, and also on translation skills, for example. So this first study that I conducted, this was in Sweden. We had students aged about 15 and 16, and I found that they spent on average 18.4 hours per week on extramural English, so all these activities. And I found that this engagement in these activities had a positive correlation with oral proficiency and also with vocabulary. And the graph shows you how much time they spent, and then this is what it looks like. So we have few, they don't do that much, but then we have others, they spend hours and hours on this outside of school. So there was also positive and strong correlations for boys, but I couldn't see the same for the girls, and that was a bit, I couldn't quite understand why, but there's an explanation. So I also found that being engaged in playing games, using the internet and reading, which tend to be more productive, those activities were, relatively speaking, more important for oral proficiency and vocabulary compared to listening to music and watching television or films, for example. You learn from those activities as well that they weren't as sort of efficient. And the boys, they simply spent more time on those, on gaming and using the internet, so they sort of benefited from that. So boys, for example, had a significantly better vocabulary than the girls. I also found that extramural English was not related at all to socioeconomic background variables. So it was a path to progress for any learner, really, as long as they have access to technology, which students or learners in Sweden. And I'm going to focus on gaming here today, and I'm interested in these commercial off-the-shelf games that they play out, on their own. So not educational games. You might recognize some of the games here. So I've done several studies on gaming. This study is also from Sweden, same age group as the ones I talked about earlier. Here we divided our sample into 3 groups. So those who gained a lot, and that cutoff was at frequent gaming, 5 hours per week, which really isn't that much if you think about it. And then we call them moderate gamers and non-gamers. And what we found here in this study was that those frequent gamers, they actually performed the best on several things. They had the highest vocabulary test score. They used the most advanced vocabulary when they wrote essays. They also had the highest rated essays. And then they left school in Sweden having the highest English grades when you compare these groups. So one thing that we can conclude from this study is that it's a myth that these gamers, they only know specialized gaming vocabulary. That's not true. They pick up a lot more than that. We also realized that this starts earlier, of course, because English is something that they as we saw in Elke's talk, for example, it starts early, and this is of course true. So this study is among those aged 11 and 12. Again, we had these three groups, and we saw that the same pattern. So those who were frequent gainers, they performed the best, and this was for vocabulary. It was also for listening comprehension and for reading comprehension. And the background variables we looked at could not explain any of these between group differences. And again, we saw that the boys actually had a better vocabulary than the girls did. Together with my colleague Sylvia, we also did a study with even younger learners. So they were 10 and 11 in grade 4 in Sweden. And this time we didn't only focus on gaming, we looked at what they did at the computer, what they spent their time on. We found that the boys, they spent more times using English on the computer than the girls did. So about twice as much, 11.4 hours compared to 5 per week. And again, we saw the explanation here for the difference between boys and girls. That was the gaming habits of the boys, and also watching films. They did that a lot more. The girls tended to use the computer for mainly for Facebooking in Swedish, so they were socializing that way. What was interesting here with very, very young learners is that they did not only engage in English in their spare time, they also, some of them actually choose to engage in Japanese. So they are interested in manga, so they pick up some Japanese from that. Also, German was mentioned in this by some students, and that was through games, interesting games. And at the bottom of this slide, you can see that the non-gamer group that was predominantly with girls. This moderate gaming group, that's typically mixed, and then where you have the frequent gamers tend to be then predominantly male, and that has been the case in all my studies and also in other studies. So this is something we see, so that we have differences when it comes to gender here with the gaming habits. Right, and I would like to spend some time explaining this figure to you now, which is a result from the study amongst the young ones here. So we asked them then, how good do you think you are at English? And they answered this in a questionnaire. And overall, for these three groups, this is a very positive finding, because most of them, they think they are either very good or okay. So very few answer here, not very good, the blue ones, very few of them. What surprised us was, how come the frequent gamers rate themselves a bit worse compared to the other groups? That was a bit surprising to us. And we were wondering, how do we explain this finding? And what we argue is that these frequent gamers, they are only 10 or 11. They are on the internet, they game with others, they game with their friends. But then, of course, also they game with people from other countries, and then they have to use English, of course. And this means they realize that there's so much English out there that I do not know. So they understand I have a lot to learn compared to, for example, the non-gamers. They do mainly, English in school, a little bit outside of school, but they do their homework and they do fine, but they don't quite know what's out there to learn. So what we say then is that this self-assessed ability in English, it seems to be affected then by the experiences of online gaming. Does that make sense to you? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Then this age group, I'm very much interested in this age group, actually 15-16-year-olds. I like that age group. So I conducted a large-scale study in Sweden, more than 1,000 participants. And I was really curious to find out, is it, the time they spend gaming that is most important? Or is it the games they choose to play, the types of digital games? And in this study, it turned out to be time that was actually more important. And it makes sense because if you practice something a lot, then you tend to improve. I also looked at what's called productive vocabulary. You know, can produce the words, and I compared gamers with non-gamers. And the gamers, they actually scored significantly higher, so it's not due to chance. They scored higher on all different vocabulary levels. So, you know, easy words and more difficult words. They scored higher at all levels. Plus, they also excelled at words that were especially difficult. So there's something going on. And as I said before, it's not true that they only learn vocabulary, game-specific vocabulary. They learn more. In addition to having lots of quantitative data from surveys with this in this study, I also conducted interviews with a smaller sample, not with 1,000 students. I had a smaller sample, and in those interviews, it became very clear that for some of these, those who have, you know, a lot of English outside of school, they have internalized English. That's what I call it, because it's so natural to them. It's just part of their everyday life. It's nothing strange at all, and they don't view themselves as learners of the language. They are just simply using English. So yeah, that's an important thing to think about. Right. And then another study from Denmark. We have people from Denmark here today. This is the even younger learners, only 8 and 10. And here in this study, we see the importance of games again. Most time spent on gaming with these Danish children, and then music in second place. And watching television is also popular. You see the gender difference again, with the boys gaming more than the girls. And again, we could see that this spare time interest that they have gaming, it actually spills up to the vocabulary knowledge. So the boys in particular benefit from this. Okay. So what about the pyramid? I mentioned I'm going to say something about the pyramid. How am I doing it?
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay. So in our book, we talk about the L2 English learning pyramid. We try to describe how language learning typically happens. So you have you go to school, you have classroom activities. You might have some English club or other extracurricular activities, at least in some countries. You have homework, and then you have this extramural English on top, separated from schooling. And that top can be different sizes, because some do a little, some do a lot. But it's not connected to the rest. But what has happened this is a changing field. What has happened is that this pyramid has changed since we sort of wrote our book. It has a new base, actually. It's more like extramural English is now the base. It's not on top. And what's interesting is, of course, that for some, that is a very solid base. Whereas for others, it's extremely thin, hardly nothing. And this poses a challenge, especially in classrooms today for teachers, because you have to deal with this. And we have what we have heard earlier today about, individual difference variables, and we have extramural English as a variable as well. So in language teaching, for example, and in research, we need to pay attention to this very, very important variable of informal learning that we have been hearing about all day today. So we have to consider it. And if we think about the time that is spent on extramural English, so with these 15 and 16-year-olds, they are in what we call input-rich settings, such as Sweden, such as Norway, such as Denmark, such as Flanders, and other countries. So back in 2009, the first study, we saw about 18 hours per week spent on this. 10 years later, in Austria, a study by Schwartz, it's up to 28 hours. So we're talking a lot more time compared to the lessons they have in school, of course. So we need to simply, we can't just ignore what's going on informally outside of educational settings and schools and so forth. So that's it for me. So I'm happy to take your question now.
Answer the questions.
Yes.
Like this, I will prepare the next. So, questions from the audience or from here.
It was kind of difficult because I didn't know where to look.
That's fine.
Yeah, Jakob, please.
It's maybe more of a comment than a question, but I think it's really interesting what you say about the baseline and how it can differ. I'm thinking about students who migrate to Norway and who come from countries where they may not have been exposed so much to English.
Yes.
And then they come to Norway, have to learn Norwegian and English, but maybe they are not using English outside of the classroom in the same way as the young people who grow up here.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a double challenge.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, of course. And for teachers who might have the, you know, all these students in the same mainstream classroom, it can be very difficult for teachers to actually cope with that situation.
Yeah, so it's a very important point, I think.
Yeah, it is. Yes, I agree. Yes, please.
I have a question on the vocabulary tests / comprehension.
Yeah.
Do you use any sort of like assessment such as IELTS, for instance, that is more common, or what kind of measurement do you use? Just very curious.
I couldn't say, did you use?
Like for the vocabulary comprehension.
Yeah.
Do you refer to IELTS assessment to be able to measure their vocabulary comprehension, or do you use some other instruments / measurements?
But for vocabulary, I use vocabulary levels test and productive levels test to get the scores. I think. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I'm just very curious on how you measure.
Okay, so we have these established vocabulary tests that I used with them, and then for also in the free writing, for example, I looked at vocabulary in free writing. So I look at advanced vocabulary, so words that are not very frequent. That is some that aren't used that much. If they use such words, it sort of indicates that they have a large vocabulary. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, just because I'm not Norwegian, so for me the standard of English language, especially in vocabulary, has always been either TOEFL or IELTS. It's more common, right? So I was just curious.
Oh, okay. Fine.
Thank you.